Thank you, Abhishek. Thank you, Angelo. Thank you, the London School of Design and Marketing for the invitation. Good afternoon to everyone attending. It is always a pleasure for me to talking about all these issues regarding visual identity, graphic design, and branding, because this is one of my passions since I was a little kid. So I will start by introducing myself just very briefly. So I'm a visual communication designer. I'm currently an assistant professor of design at the University of Aveiro in Portugal. I'm also a visiting professor at the Innovation School at the Glasgow School of Art in Scotland, UK, and currently an integrated member of the Research Institute for Design, Media and Culture, which is a joint research institute between the University of Aveiro and the University of Porto in Portugal. And specifically, I'm working with the Unexpected Media Lab. I'm also a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts in the UK, because I spent a few years in London doing my PhD and also working and teaching at the Central St. Martin's at the University of the Arts London. So I have a big connection with the United Kingdom regarding, design. I have prepared a series of slides which actually are a collection of different presentations, and perhaps I would start by explaining a little bit where I'm coming from. And this is actually me with 4 years old and wearing a pair of shoes from a Portuguese brand which was well known at the time. They were very popular and mostly the unique or the only brand existing in Portugal due to the political constraints occurring at the time. So Portugal was under an authoritarian regime, and there was this policy basically dictating that investments should be on strategic areas in the Portuguese economy. So there was not much investment, and those investments were not also allowed to happen regarding footwear and specifically sneakers. So these sneakers are part today of the cultural memory of several generations of Portuguese people. And when I was a kid, I was struck by these sneakers, and they became some sort of an object of desire. And along with this passion about these sneakers, they came the interests around the product itself, the materials, the colors, the shape, the names, all these ingredients, which later I could understand they were part of a visual identity. So basically this brand influenced me as a graphic designer, and that was the main reason why I decided to pursue a career in graphic design, working for different companies, designing logotypes, designing all sorts of visual materials, especially in Porto, where I'm from and where I'm based right now. All this creativity and all these interests around the visuals basically shaped me not only as a graphic designer, but also as a person. And I have continued working with other companies in the UK, and especially more recently, I was able to explore a more personal graphic design approach, which would not be much dependent on these softwares which everybody has access to, and these softwares which help shaping the way people, or most people, or at least many people, do graphic design today. So regarding graphic design, there is, in my case, this sense of pursuing an individual personal expression and using graphic design as a means to communicate in a personal way, basically.
Pedro, I'm sorry, the slide is not showing, at least for me. Not sure if that's happening
Yeah,
to
the speaker
everybody else.
slide is not showing.
If you don't mind seeing what's happening.
Okay, resume share. Okay. For some reason, I have this notice here saying sharing is paused. Bring your shared window to the front.
Tiago, can you help Pedro, please? Because we will really like to see Pedro as a child.
Try again. Out and turn on.
So I will stop sharing.
Yeah. And see.
And I will share again.
Yeah.
Okay. What about now?
Yeah, so we can see the velvet season in the outside. But
okay.
we would really appreciate if you can show us the picture of
you as a child.
Yes, with
you didn't see those ones.
No, not at all.
Okay, I was speaking while I was passing the slides at the same time.
Okay.
So yeah, so this is me with 4 years old, wearing a pair of sneakers, and this is very significant because this represents that I have convinced my parents to give me a pair of these shoes, and at the time I didn't know what a brand was. I didn't know that shoes would have names, and I didn't know that there was such a thing that one could call a brand. So this passion for sneakers basically was what influenced me as a graphic designer. Here, this is me again with a different brand, and here again in 1981, wearing another pair of Sanjos. And this one has a particular story which I don't delve into right now, but basically to say that because of the Sanjo sneakers, I got this interest in graphic design, and I started working professionally as a graphic designer, and basically at a time when softwares and computers became available, and softwares like Freehand, which now are the similar is InDesign or Illustrator, and basically there was a point that I decided to develop a more personal approach to the graphic design I was doing, and start not being ashamed anymore of the handwriting skills and the calligraphy and illustrations, and therefore making a differentiation point by using my own skills and interests and ways of expression. And this is important to say because in the end, each one of us may have something to show the world which is different from anyone else. And this is where the globalization of visual identity can fit in. This is when we tend to follow certain trends, tend to follow the use of certain typefaces, and sometimes we forget about what our inner strengths are. And for many years, I struggled with assuming my own graphic language and what we are seeing here is basically a collaboration which is over 15 years with two record labels in London. I started working with them precisely because I went to the shop buying a series of records, and I had a list handwritten, and they saw my notebook and asked, who's this letter from? This is my handwriting. And they went to the offices inside, and the manager came, and they were saying that they were at the time looking for someone to design for them in a different way. So when we are honest with ourselves, when we decide to assume what we are, and when we are lucky enough to find inside ourselves our motivations, our interests, instead of following other people, maybe we can find our place in the world, and maybe we can position ourselves much better in relation to what other people do. And I think this links to another slide, or to the set of questions I would like to bring in. I'm not sure you can see the text that I'm showing. Yeah, can you read the text?
I can only read Velvet Season and the Hearts of Gold.
Yeah,
the CD cover.
Share.
Okay. So I will stop sharing, and I will share again. Because...
Share the screen, not the tab.
The window, yeah.
Can you see right now a red slide?
Ollins 1989, right?
Exactly. So
okay.
Basically in 1989, Wally Ollins, which is one of the main characters and personalities within visual identity in the 20th century, said that we are entering an epoch in which only those corporations making highly competitive products will survive. And this means in the longer term that products from major competing companies around the world will become increasingly similar. And this touches the notion that many brands are looking the same. And this is something that I, as a graphic designer, had to tap in. Another quote from Ball and Naylor in 2005 refers to how companies tend to frame their questions. So what is your target audience is a contextual question asked more frequently than what is your ideological position. So what is the contribution of the designer to the world? So market economy is driving all before it, and commercial worth is increasingly taking precedence over cultural value. So my work started looking more into the cultural value of objects and brands rather than as mere commodities. And that was the main reason why when I started doing my PhD, and before that I did my master's, asking what happened to this brand that I was so passionate about. What happened to this cultural icon which suddenly disappeared from the shops, and you could not find it anymore. So what happened is that this brand was very popular in the 20th century until the 1990s. And then it disappeared completely. So I figured out that the brand basically closed down because it could not compete with international brands coming from abroad. So these multinational brands which took over the market and basically contributed for these small, locally specific brands to disappear. And there is another quote here, which I find very interesting from McDermott. So there is a widespread and shared feeling that we are living in an era of globalization, of multinational business, and an increasing homogenization of culture. So globalization is the process by which companies operate on an international level and socioeconomic patterns become adopted on a global scale. So global as a term is often interchangeable with international. It is frequently perceived as opposed to regionalization and often associated with the wiping out of regional and national identities. Many are arguing that differences are disappearing and the consequent uniformity is a major threat to world culture, and worry that we will all soon be living in a world of bland product conformity. It is interesting that we have today here in this class an audience coming from all parts of the world. And eventually you may think about this phenomena happening in your countries. How many brands do you remember, or how many brands made part of your parents' and grandparents' lives which do not exist anymore? How many brands, international, multinational ones, became so popular and so desirable in your countries that what is locally specific, what is cultural, valuable and different is becoming not accessible anymore. And this is another example, another brand of sneakers from Portugal, which became popular as well. These ones were cheaper than the Sanjos. So these were like the sneakers for the less privileged classes. This is another case of a Portuguese brand which also unfortunately disappeared. So one may think about branding as one of the main factors to be different. So if branding is about being different, if everyone is doing the same kind of visual approaches, if everyone is using more or less the same software, if everyone is using or following the same trends in terms of aesthetics, the visuals, the typefaces, and so on, how can one become different? So in the present day, it is true that we are bombarded daily with brand imagery that is hard to digest. It is even harder to decode such imageries because they result from the articulation of complex graphic compositions applied across multiple formats and media. So brands are part of our lives, but maybe we don't think much about it. So let me just explain and help you deconstruct visual identity systems from a theoretical point of view. And I would say that branding or visual identity, the main start or the starting point resides into the use of visual elements. So all brands and all visual identity systems start with the creation of an alphabet and a grammar. So what is the alphabet? The alphabet of brand identity consists of the elements that can be understood as part of the brand identity system. And these basic elements, so they are the basic elements and the complementary elements, and both the basic elements and the complementary ones make the alphabet of visual identity and therefore of branding. So the basic elements basically are a name. All brands have a name. All organizations have a name. Ultimately, one person has a name which can be turned into a brand name. All brands have a symbol or a sign, which lately or ultimately can become a symbol. But basically, they have names, they have signs attached to the names on the top, on the sides, or enmeshed with the name. And all visual identity systems have to deal with typography. They have to use typefaces to accompany all the informations they have to communicate. One may think that, okay, all brands have their own typefaces, but today one can also speak about communications on Facebook, on Instagram, on Twitter, and so on and so forth. And one has to use the typefaces that Facebook and Instagram supply, basically. Nevertheless, typography and typefaces are a core part of the basic elements as much as the color. And one may think of color only as spot colors, as Pantone colors, a set of you know, two major colors. Let's see, for example, Vodafone is black and white. Ferrari is mainly red. Perhaps they use also a bit of yellow and black. One may think of Adidas, the originals, like the blue. Well, there is a sense of, or a strategic way of using color as a system. So there is an approach to color as a way to help defining the identity system of a particular brand. For example, going back to the Sanjo case, here we have a name, we have an icon, which is this lozenge, which tell us about the properties of rubber. It's kind of elastic. There are also graphic elements around. There are typefaces and there are colors. 2 tones of blue, for example, over a white background. And there are also the complementary elements, which are also part of visual identity. And these mostly refer to imagery, for example, the use of other graphic elements, which are not necessarily a typeface or color or a name or a sign. So they can be of a different nature. There is the 5th element, and for you to have an idea what a 5th element is, basically, if you think of Adidas, you can spot that some particular shoes are Adidas because of the 3 stripes. So the 3 stripes are a 5th element, which helps reinforcing the identification of those particular products as being part of a certain brand, in this case, Adidas. But brands can also use photography, illustration, or a combination of any of these elements as complementary elements which make part of their own alphabet. And then there is the grammar. For example, on this side, on the left side, you can see the names, you can see the icons, you can see signs, you can see the names expressed either with lettering or using a font or a typeface, whether it is a generic one or specifically designed for that purpose. And on the right-hand side, you can see compositions. You can see a relatedness combination of these basic and complementary elements at work. So you can see illustration, you can see photography, you can see other graphic elements at play, basically, which go beyond the mere utilization of the basic and complementary elements. So there is some sort of logic or rationale, which I call the grammar, which is the way in which these brands decide to articulate the elements from the alphabet to form these more complex compositions. So we start into this idea of grammar. So grammar in visual identity refers to how the basic and the complementary elements are articulated according to a set of guidelines or a rationale. So both the alphabet and grammar originate usually from a central idea or a set of brand values. So if every organization is different from the other, if as us, if we have a point or if we have something to bring to the world, what is that? Can we define it? If we are able to define it, maybe we can come to a central idea that distinguishes us from any other person. So the same applies to organizations. How does, for example, two airline companies, what distinguish them? Why do we have so many airline companies, and why do they have so different identities in terms of colors, in terms of communications, in terms of positioning, in terms of ideology? Some are low cost, others more luxurious. All organizations can be in a way summarized according to a central idea or to a set of values. So the grammar is what gives these organizations a sense of the brand. So the articulation of the basic and complementary elements of visual identity according to a set of guidelines, according to a specific grammar, can be found across all the tangible manifestations of these organizations. So we can organize these tangible manifestations broadly according to products, the physical result, the physical objects that organizations produce. And one can think about products as much as services, for example, online services, communications, whether printed or digital, and environments, the offices, the shops, the factories, the corner points for selling, whatever. So this is where one can find all these materials. And when I was doing my research on the Sanjo sport shoes and asking myself what happened to this particular brand, I figured out that not much was available in terms of history, no history written. It was hard to find products. It was hard to find tangible materials that I could look at in terms of extracting the visual aspects, the visual components, to understand what the alphabet was and what was the grammar. So this led me into field research and basically touring the Portuguese country and searching for this kind of tangible materials in old shops, in old workers from the factory, in people who have owned these shoes, so in people's houses, in family albums and so on. And ultimately, I was able to find materials that would allow me to see, for example, how the brand mark design evolved over time, and how it changed, ultimately to resemble the global brands. And what I could realize is that there was a shift in the visual identity of this brand becoming, quite specific in a way, into a more bland uniformity of shapes and typefaces and fonts and so on, and becoming more like the multinational ones. And this is how as a graphic designer, I decided to kind of leave the construction of visual identity systems from scratch, and started focusing my practice into the deconstruction of pre-existing visual identity systems. So I decided to apply this graphic design sort of expertise, not to design for new companies, but to study the cultural relevance of iconic brands which existed in the past and suddenly disappeared due to the globalization. And we have here an image which seems a bit complex, but I hope it helps illustrate how this notion of deconstruction, so if a graphic designer can think about the visual identity elements, the basic and the complementary ones, to construct a visual identity system, the same principles can be used to decode, to deconstruct, to understand how a brand looks like. And this image is, it relates to a workshop that I've been doing for many years now at the Glasgow School of Art with product design students, helping them understanding the principles of visual identity. And we start by decoding existing brands so that they can understand what are the main ingredients needed for brand identity construction, so that they can assimilate, incorporate these principles in order to be able at least to, if not to construct their own brands, at least to communicate with graphic designers in terms of creating interdisciplinary approach to build their own brands, or at least to construct the visual identity for the products they design. And maybe here I can now swap to this decoding of visual identity systems, the alphabet and grammar. I will pass very rapidly these images and the text, because this is mainly the brief I usually give to product design students to help them understand what visual identity is about. So this is a workshop, and it unfolds into sequential complementary parts. So the first part is about understanding the theoretical background of visual identity through identifying the alphabet and grammar of a certain brand they will have to choose. Then they are asked to map their findings according to a set structure. And this structure is basically organizing their findings according to the basic and the complementary elements. So the second part links the second part of the workshop. I will stop sharing because I think sharing is paused. Yeah. So I will share again. So this workshop unfolds in two parts. The first one to decode visual identity, and the second one to explore ways in which they can construct and characterize their own identity systems. So we saw a few of the elements here, some of the slides. For example, this is a case of one particular brand, which is a headphones brand. And this image displays the findings of the students. And it is possible to find here, actually, to see that this brand was through 3 different brand development stages. So the ingredients they have used when they started are different from the number 2 here. So at a certain point, they have decided to use a different set of ingredients, so the basic elements and the different grammar. And more recently, they have adopted a third visual identity system. So by working with this kind of exercises, one can become much more aware of how a visual identity system is created. And by decoding and by deconstructing these identity systems, it is much easier to understand the basics and the principles behind identity construction. So the students here are also able to think better about what they want to develop and apply to their own products and to their own identity systems. I would like to go a bit fast into these slides, because there is something I would like to say regarding identity construction. And this is basically the set structure of the workshop the students do. And about identity construction, so the students are asked to start prototyping their own brands. For example, even if they don't know, or even if they don't have a specific brand to work upon, or even if they don't have a product, a finished product, they may want to find, or may they be able to find a list of attributes, of properties, characteristics, and maybe they can find images which help them explaining what they sense. And this is how the second stage of the workshop usually helps them prototyping and rapidly prototyping the visual identity for their own products, by collecting and choosing, selecting these ingredients. What would the typeface look like? What kind of signs could express your intentions? What kind of colors would be adequate to communicate your intents? What kind of possibilities would you have for the name? For example, here, the name crack just came all of a sudden, and the way in which it became represented was done very rapidly by using, some of these visual references, cutting, smashing, cracking this piece of paper, which has originated the logotype. So very rapidly, by understanding these principles, and by experimenting, one can start working around these possibilities. So they start speculating what could represent you, find examples of what it could be. You may also think about the likely need of various versions for different uses and test possibilities for applications. Experimenting with photography, collage, photocopy, thinking about the requirements for the typefaces. How would you like to be the tone of voice. Would it be a tall face? Would it be a large face? Would it be bold? Would it be thin? Would it be light? Smooth, fast, direct, poetic, fictional, warm? You know, all these things helps us as designers to start shaping and deciding what kind of sense for the brand we would like to provide. And so on and so forth. So this is how the basic elements and the complementary elements can be thought of in terms of deconstructing for understanding visual identity systems, but how can they be also applied as an exercise to prototype identity systems? Yeah. And instead of you know, following how can I say trends, if you work more naturally, eventually innovation will come, and eventually it comes better when you only know about attributes and try to find ways to correspond, visually correspond to these attributes. So proto-branding using, you know, this idea of alphabet and grammar. So from now, I will jump into something else. So I will stop sharing and we'll share again. Because I've been applying these methods to design education as well. So in the University of Aveiro, not in Glasgow, and referring to the case of Sanjo and the Portuguese brands, which do not exist anymore, although they are part of our cultural memory. It was interesting to work with students from 2005 and 2007. And there was an enormous amount of brands the students were able to collect and to represent visually. And it was interesting to see the richness of the visual materials they have found. And it was also interesting to see how these findings can be thought of as a resource to feed new developments, to think about the cultural specificities of the country, to use these as raw materials to apply to contemporary products. And along this study, including not just the work with the students, but especially the one I did with the PhD, was the fact that us as graphic designers have our own methods, and we can use the strength of our visual approaches to apply to our studies and to apply to our practices from a methodological perspective. What we are seeing here is basically a chronology. But this chronology is not a usual chronology. It is divided according to different rows. And in each row, you can organize the information about a particular case in a different way. For example, to see how the organization evolved, how the context has influenced the organization and vice versa, how the logotype or the brand mark designs evolved, how communications evolved, how the product designs evolved, how the technological processes involved for manufacturing, in this particular case, the shoes, also changed. And by observing these transformations over time, one can also see how this brand, which was very specific in the way they were producing and manufacturing shoes, all of a sudden adopted technologies which were common to many other brands. And also they have adopted visual elements which were more or were less specific, and by doing so, it means the visual identity or the brand essence dissolved by adopting, these global trends, and by relinquishing their own differentiation factors. There is one case here. If in the beginning of the brand, one could see how specific was their product designs, in the later stage of the brand, one can see they were trying to mimic, for example, the Converse or the Nike, or even a Puma, a product design, and here a fifth element which resembles the Vans, for example. So this led me into defining brand archaeology, not just as a field of study, but also as a methodological approach. And similarly to the decoding of visual identity systems, the first part of brand archaeology is comprised of ethnographic research, combining industrial archaeology with visual anthropology, case study research, meaning that there is one part focused into the gathering, the collection of visual materials, but not just visual, the products themselves and information related to the company, to the context, and so on. And then there is a second stage which has to do with the assessment of the information and the assessment of these findings, and using these findings as the materials which can feed then the new developments. This is an exhibition in London in 2012, so almost 10 years now, and it showed the case of Sanjo, how explaining how it disappeared from the market, how it evolved in the beginning of the 20th century, how it rose, and then how and why it declined. At the same time, the exhibition shows about the methods. Some of the information here I can share with you. You can find this catalog of the exhibition as well as my PhD thesis online, so I can share you the link. And then some of my practice has been applying these methods to other institutions. For example, here applied to a design school in Paris, struggling with finding their own, position in their origins, so they became something else. And by analyzing how it evolved, it is easier to see where their differentiation factors are, and where have they been lost at some point. Here applied at the Glasgow School of Art in design education. Here applied to a chocolate factory, also a popular chocolate brand in Portugal, and how we can make sense about the retrieval of these materials. In this particular case, the study helped informing the management to decide or to work upon strategic and making strategic decisions for new product developments. So understanding about their past. They will be able to better understand what their essence is about, and therefore they will be able to focus on what makes them different, basically. Another case, a more how can I say, exploratory one, related to the city of Porto and the Digital Museum of the Porto University. And this is one of my favorite parts. If with the case of Sanjo, it was not possible for me to deploy or to think about new product developments, at least considering the original factory and the original production technologies, because they have disappeared. The factory was torn down. The brand ultimately resisted. It was bought by someone who started producing in China. Recently it came to Portugal, but they are developing replicas and they have nothing to do with the original ways of production, and there are some substantial differences in terms of the product design. So the shape looks more or less the same, but in essence we are talking about something different. It was possible to for me to work with another brand where they still had the machines operating, and they were also an iconic example. So the brand Archaeology was applied to this brand. So there was this part into researching about the organizational context, observing the factory, the means of production, analyzing the imagery, how impactful it was in cultural terms, trying to assess how popular this brand was and by whom it was used. It was also possible to identify the main iconic products, and by using the same molds, by using the same machines, by using materials that were still present in the factory, like old stocks and materials for footwear manufacturing, it was possible to produce more contemporary approaches in terms of product design for this company. I was privileged at this time. I was supervising the PhD of Abhishek, so I was privileged to have Abhishek working with me at the time, and we had an amazing journey, and we had a lot of fun using old machines, using old materials, using old designs, and making them with a contemporary look, basically. So we didn't follow any trends. We didn't do any project, so there was a lot of improvisation and working with the resources at hand, and this is where creativity came at play, and this is where I believe differentiation can come from. We were also fortunate because I was having another PhD student who was looking into traditional weaving technique coming from the 11th century, almost disappearing in one generation or two. It may disappear, and we made this cross-fertilization, this hybridization, so using an iconic footwear manufacturer under threats, combined with hand weaving technique also under threat, and we were able to produce these unique exclusive pairs of shoes which have the combination of two different iconic components from the Portuguese culture, footwear manufacturing and this weaving technique. And it was the first time that this weaving technique was applied to footwear production. So a very interesting, how can I say, innovation project. And triggered by my interest around the Sanjo brand, and I was able to collect over 300 pairs of original Sanjos. And then after doing the archaeology of the Cortebel brand, which is the other footwear brand that we just saw, my interests opened up in terms of looking at the relationship between what happened between graphic design, and specifically graphic design, but also product design, and the footwear, the Portuguese footwear industry regarding sneakers. So I've started a collection of Portuguese sneaker brands. So I'm currently working on this collection, which is over 50 different Portuguese brands, specifically from the last quarter of the 20th century. And this links to where I started by saying that in Portugal we had an authoritarian regime, which lasted from 1933 until 1974. And from 74 onwards, you could see a boom, sort of an explosion of different brands of sneakers, and most of them have also disappeared. So I've been looking at the relationship between what happened with design, in the relationship between design and the footwear industry. And it is interesting to see that the ties between design and the footwear industry are very weak. So it's very interesting to analyze all these brands from this visual identity perspective. And this collection ultimately will form a contribution for understanding how the sneaker culture in Portugal evolved, not just from a visual identity perspective, but also from a broad design perspective, and ultimately ending this part of the research, which has to do with collecting this information. The second stage will be about what to do with these materials and how can we address contemporary needs, contemporary challenges, by knowing about the past of our history. Some of the series also produced at Cortebel, in this case combining the footwear factory here in Portugal, using tweed from Scotland. So this was a series that we have produced. And then we started working with using textiles which are locally specific, and using those textiles to produce new shoes from the old machines and from the old molds. But more recently, we started a new path, which has to do with addressing these concerns around sustainability. So we started producing shoes using industrial waste. In this case, industrial waste from a textiles factory in Scotland. So these shoes are made with cashmere. We also worked with a student of mine who is a textile designer, and I was supervising her masters, and she has produced new fabrics from industrial waste, from which we made this footwear series, also using recycled rubber and other ingredients. So maybe I'm going too long, I'm not sure what the time is, but I've been over almost one hour. I like very much these shoes because they are made with the fabric from old curtains. And maybe I will stop sharing here this presentation. There would be a lot to talk about. Every and each one of these cases could feed one entire session. But I wanted to, just give you a glimpse of the ingredients of visual identity, the concerns about how can we be different in a globalized world, how the brand archaeology set of methods can be useful within design education, design research, and design practice, how passion, inner passion, can shape us both as designers and as persons, and how you can transform dust into blooming through an innovative process and through a different way of seeing things.
Well, thanks, Pedro. I think your presentation was extremely insightful. And I think you're right regarding what you mentioned regarding deconstruction. Deconstruction is probably a way for us to look inside instead of look outside in terms of innovating, in terms of generating innovation. And I think that's a very good approach. So basically, through your works, what we can see is that branding and visual identity is not just a strategic outlook of a company or an enterprise, but it can also have a deeper meaning, a deeper connect, for example, with the geography, for example, with the industrial sector or with the cultural roots. And one more thing which you mentioned regarding passion. Passion is very important. You were able to, let's say, marry the two passions together, the one for footwear and the other one for visual identity, and sorry, for graphic design, through conceptualizing or through deconstructing the visual identity of different brands, and that was the manner in which you basically generated innovation for the entities that you have mentioned, not only in terms of graphic design, but also in terms of product design, also in terms of marketing. So that was very interesting to see. I just have a couple of questions. What are the, you already spoke about the various elements that, help construct or deconstruct a relevant visual identity. But if say, for example, somebody, a student or a new professional, new designer is working with a global company that does not have some kind of a root in a certain cultural identity, unlike, say, for example, Sanjos or, for example, Cortobel, how would they utilize this approach towards generating value, towards generating innovation within the company setup which they are at?
Well, I've shown the workshop that was designed for the Glasgow School of Art because it is precisely about enabling the design of visual identity processes from scratch. So one can apply this knowledge to cases where there is no prior background, but yet one of the brand archaeology methods, which has to do with mapping can be applied not only to the historical past, but can be also applied in a different way, which has to do with understanding the broad environment where the organization sits. I was referring the other day to my students in Aveiro about the design of Metro do Porto. So I designed the Metro of Porto visual identity system in 2001, and it was kind of a straightforward way to do, because the first task was basically to find examples of identity systems in metros from around the world. And at the time, internet was not as huge as it is today, but it was possible to find around 30 examples from around the world, from the internet and from cases that we visited ourselves. And I would say it was my first visual mapping or visual methodologies project. And by bringing all those logos together, two things came apparent almost immediately. One was the dominance of a certain shape, the circle or the circumference, and the other one was the existence of an M. So the identity of the visual identity of metro systems is closely linked to the use of circles and M's. So this informed by almost naturally how the Metro of Porto identity system could be, or what kind of shapes we could use, or ingredients, the elements. So what I want to say is that even if you don't have a past, still you can use this sort of visual mapping through research to amass a substantial amount of information which can help you positioning yourselves in relation to the broader context and find what your main differentiation is or can be. Also in terms of helping you prototyping how it can look like, or what kind of brand values you may want to incorporate.
So I think in terms of globalization, that can be an example, isn't it? So you opened up the context and you looked at the different examples of metros from around the world, perhaps, and you found this pattern of circles and of the letter M. M is for metro, of course. So basically you looked at the global context and you arrived at a common ground. And based on that, you created or developed your design. So that in itself says that the research is of extreme importance in design. And
exactly.
whatever when we are starting out, we always start out or we always take up or approach a project based on hunches or based on assumptions, but that should not be the case. The design decisions should be, of course, people will have their natural flair, they will have their natural angle to a sort of design issue, but at the same time, research is of as much importance, would you say, if not more, than the design process itself?
Yeah. So in the case of Metro do Porto, it was the process, and in fact the research which led to the design. So the design resulted almost naturally from the research and from what we did with the research. Okay, and you stressed the main point, which is the fact that okay, one can do design with no research, but we don't know what will come out, and we don't know how connected or how much disconnected it will be, or how many similar things will be found related to what we are proposing. Yeah, absolutely. So research is absolutely critical. and absolutely mandatory in any case. And as a conclusion, I can say that by looking at my work retrospectively, the most interesting things that I've done resulted from deep research. So the deeper the research, the richer will be the content. But research is not just about amassing information. It must incorporate ways for dealing with that information. So what can we do with that, and the meaning we derive or the sense we make from the materials we'll collect and from the information that we search for will ultimately inform our process, and eventually will lead us to somewhere new or different, or to us as different, you know.
Exactly, and that is where critical thinking, I think, comes into the picture, because you have gathered a lot of materials. I'm just saying, as an example, and how do you synthesize that material would be through critical thinking regarding the research. So critically analyzing, for example, what is there, putting them into patterns or whatever it is, the methods, the approaches which we implement towards understanding what we have at hand and how we can make it more actionable.
Yeah, I have to say, in the case of Sancho, I literally started from scratch. There was almost anywhere I could start from. So it was a very laborious process into collecting information, and most of the times in the beginning, I didn't know what to do with this information. It was the collection of the different pieces of the puzzle which allowed visualizing, you know, the bigger picture. And as much information was being gathered, the clearer the picture and the scenario was becoming.
Great. Maybe I think it's time we can take a couple of questions. If anybody any of the participants have, I think I'm seeing something from Ahmad, who's saying, is it not about what the audience care about? And as you said, differences are fading away gradually, which means there is a cultural aspect or crisis that makes local communities want to fit into the global scene. And I think it's a very valid question, because we have seen it in our case as well, you know, I mean, where people are modifying their approach, they're modifying their product to suit global trends, to suit global consumer preferences, for example.
Well, I have to say that as a designer, I tend to work in a different way, rather than answering to people's demands. So as a designer, I pose my own questions and I define my own territory of intervention. Regarding the audience, what I can say regarding shoes is that the shoes we've been designing are quite appealing, because they are quite different from what there is. And in the end of the day, branding is dealing with difference. If you place something different there and meaningful, eventually you will find its natural audience. So I don't design for specific audiences which are demanding certain aspects. And historically, what we can see also in the sales sector is that people would buy anything. If you say this is very, very sustainable, eventually people will not ask whether it is or not. People will just assume it is, because they will trust what you're saying. So what you say is really important, and important in the sense of, for the sake of honesty. For example, the brand Sancho was being manufactured in China. At a time, there was an increasing demand because, you know, this phenomena of brand revivals, of looking to our own brands, and it seems like overnight people start becoming more interested in these old school shoes and brands. So the owners of the brand didn't find, well, they found in China a cheaper way and a faster way to produce the sneakers, but the sneakers were being marketed as, you know, 100% Portuguese
made in Portugal.
Yeah. So they knew what they were doing, and in some cases the shoes, because it is mandatory in the shoes to say where they were made, they were deliberately putting the label in a almost invisible part of the shoe where one can hardly go to see that they were made in China. And when people started noticing they were made in China, they started reacting differently. So, of course, the marketing approach will depend largely on market studies. They will try to figure out what people want. But for example, what are, and going back to one of the questions that I posed, if so more often than not, companies pose their questions into what is your market audience target, rather than what is your ideological position. So as a designer, and if we are forming designers, we are forming people who are responsible for social transformations and cultural transformations. So my question would be, where do you stand? Where do you want to be? So are you attentive to the news? Are you honestly pursuing a career to address contemporary issues and concerns, or are you concerned about making money? It was also impossible to work with the brand owners of Sanjo, because they were deliberately more interested in buying the Porsche and making money as fast as possible, rather than, for example, using sustainable materials, or being faithful to the brand as a Portuguese brand and being manufactured in Portugal. They were claiming that we could not find a factory in Portugal where we could manufacture. That is not true. Yeah. So where do you stand? Where do you stand?
Exactly. So what would your advice be for new designers, for people who are just getting into the field? I mean, how can they take what should their stance be? Because probably they're working in large corporations, they might not have the freedom as an individual designer. How do you think they can implement this approach and at the same time basically not piss off the management? Sorry for the term.
Well, the first thing would be asking yourselves whether this is exactly the field where you want to work. Point number one. Are you being truthful to yourself? Are you being honest enough? Or are you following a trend and thinking about working in design because it is fancy, or because you will find a job? What I mean is that don't study design for the wrong reasons. Yeah, that is the first thing. The second thing, I think you're right. In many cases, people will struggle a lot with the lack of freedom, because they will join structures where even ideologically you can work against your own values, or you can be asked to do the things that you don't believe, or that you don't find are responding or addressing present day concerns. But the good news is that these issues and these concerns are becoming so globalized as well that I think you should be very critical about choosing a place where to work and choosing who you would like to work for. So I think you should think about it, and hopefully and luckily today there are many companies, also because of political legislations and obligations and so on. So companies now are obliged to follow certain standards and follow certain rules. So if you want to have a takeaway coffee, plastic will not be possible to use, for example. What I mean is that hopefully and luckily there is a wide variety of companies which are doing great, and those are the ones you should look for, basically.
So yeah,
okay. But I totally understand that in many cases that's not possible, because you are already into a system that you have to feed yourself and your family, so you need to work for the money.
To follow certain obligations which are put in place. But at the same time, I think it's good to at least on a personal level, keep on feeding these kind of values, so that when you get the chance, you can actually make the right kind of difference. And saying that, I think we've already overshot our time limit, and I think we should close. If there's no other questions, we can look to conclude the session. Does anybody have a question? Yes, there will be the recording will be available in our YouTube channel. Ahmad says, to what extent the designer can push and fight for the valid solution against the marketing? I think we've already sort of touched upon that. The thing is that it depends upon your personal context. If you have a certain pressing need, of course, but also it depends, I think, on superiority in your organization. If you are just starting into the profession, it might be slightly more tricky than if you are, say, for example, a design manager. But I think, yes, values are important. And I think, yes, you should completely look at it from your own perspective, which values are most important to you. And I think you should take the decisions based on your instinctive purview. And that's what we have been discussing right now. Yeah.
Regarding this question, yeah, it's true. It's not about the thing. It's about the thing that sells the thing.
The thing, exactly.
So what I mean is that there is a very strong relationship between design and marketing. So yeah. On the one hand, if designers are able to produce this kind of products or solutions and stuff, marketing will play a very important role to communicate adequately what is being proposed. What I mean is that, and we can see for these shoes that we have presented, they would benefit largely with an adequate marketing campaign, for example.
Yeah, exactly.
So,
and I also think that the research angle which you mentioned, I mean, the importance of the research is the same for marketing. There is nothing which is stopping marketing from decoding or demystifying or deconstructing the identity of a brand or a context as well as anybody in design can. So whereas the designers will use different tools, correct me if I'm wrong, but whereas the designer will use different tools, marketing professionals can use different tools as well in determining or deconstructing a brand identity.
Yeah, and I think it's a very good combination. In advertising, there was these classic teams. So having one graphic designer and a copywriter working in tandem. Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
So the copywriter would produce the content, and the graphic designer would make it visible in an appealing way. The same way and similarly, design and marketing can work in tandem as well, and reinforcing and helping each other. Design eventually by providing this kind of content, and marketing finding ways to making it or to make its relevance visible to broader audiences. Yeah.
Great. So I think with that particular insight, we will conclude this session. Thank you again, Pedro, for joining us and with sharing.
Thank you.
Sharing your immense wealth of information and knowledge with us. And we look forward to hearing more from you later. Thank you again for all the participants who've joined us. It's been great to have you here. And yeah, and I really hope that you had a good take back from this session. So again, I will mention here that the session was recorded, and the recording will be available on our YouTube channel in future in a couple of days, I think. And yeah, wish you a very nice evening, and see you.